Hello, everyone. I'm Frederick Johnson, and welcome to Conversations with For Our Common Good. For Our Common Good is committed to amplifying the voices of and spreading awareness of community nonprofits. Advocacy for a wide range of issues is more important now than ever before. Our focus today is modern slavery and human trafficking. I have the privilege of sitting down with Joanna Ewart James, Executive Director and co-founder of Freedom United, the world's largest community dedicated to ending human trafficking and modern slavery. The work of Freedom United has impacted 195 countries with 113 global partners, 95 worldwide campaigns, and millions of worldwide volunteers and supporters, all dedicated to a mission of ending modern slavery and human trafficking, and all since its inception just 5 short years ago. Ms. Ewart James's very impressive career has been dedicated first to human rights in general and ultimately to modern slavery and human trafficking specifically, which culminated in the co-founding of Freedom United in 2017. In addition to Freedom United, Ms. Ewart James recently completed her term as chair of the board of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative and is currently a trustee at the Labor Behind the Label Trust, which campaigns for workers' rights in clothing industry. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak in this series. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to explain a bit more about what we're doing and how we work.
Wonderful. Well, tell me, what moved you to the world of human rights and then to focus on modern slavery and human trafficking?
So, I would say that I'm actually very privileged, not least because I haven't experienced the kind of rights violations that I'm looking to address, and certainly not modern slavery. And I think in recognising that, I look at the injustices and just feel so frustrated that I just need to do something about it. And so for me, it's been a real professional passion to work in this space, work in this sector over the last 20 odd years. And more recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, been looking specifically at the topic of modern slavery and human trafficking. And that's something that is relevant to all of us, to everyone, because in fact, we are connected to these forms of exploitation through global supply chains, through the products that we buy, we use, we enjoy, and through a system that really is quite heavily reliant on the exploitation of others. And that gave me a real impetus to get involved in bringing light to the fact that this is happening, building awareness, and really trying to change our social values so that this is something that we're clear should not be tolerated, and that others should be making change happen so that exploitation is not a part of our lives, our world, and our future.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I want to quote a couple of portions from your vision about obtaining a vision of a world free from modern slavery and human trafficking. And that includes mobilizing a united community to create power for change by making the public stakeholders in ending modern slavery as allies to survivor advocates, and equipping millions of supporters with awareness, education, and ways to take action that drive real change. So taking those initiatives one at a time, like how do they work and how do you achieve those initiatives?
So whenever we see change in the world, it's come about because of a movement. And we can think of so many examples, just looking back in history, of how change has happened. I think the civil rights movement is a really good example, not to say that we have got to where we want to be, but we see progress in the women's rights movement too. The right to vote is a very specific example, but again, we're not as far along in that as we'd like to be. When we think about the story of how the world got there, then what features heavily in your mind, I would imagine, at least for myself, and I think many people, is the people who take action, the people who get engaged, who come together, the demonstrations, the highlighting the outrage, the action, the dedication, the commitment of those people. If they're not there doing their thing, then the status quo will just continue. yes, you might get some changes here and there, but do they sustain the kind of in-depth change that we need to hold the world accountable? I would say no. I say that to make change happen and for it to stay, you need a united community. And that community needs to be a mass community of people that has enough power to say, this isn't how things should be, and can actually shift the status quo. And we do that by getting the public, regular people involved in ending modern slavery. And we specifically say as allies to survivor advocates, because they have experienced exactly what it is we're talking about. They understand what needs to happen, what needs to change. We need to be working alongside them, and really we should be led by them as a big community of active citizens, standing up and saying, this isn't right, we want to see change happen. And that, I think, is how change is sustained. So how do we actually do it? Well, we have a platform on freedomunited.org where we host our petitions. We send out a news digest every Sunday where we highlight some of the key stories from around the world on modern slavery. So in our journey, we know that we need to start with an understanding of what modern slavery is. And I think there's a lot of, it's not necessarily a shared understanding of what it is that we're talking about. I think human trafficking, modern slavery, these are different words. They mean the same thing. Do they have different meanings? Is slavery something from history? Is it relevant today? Is it the right term to use today? What about bonded labor, debt bondage, sex trafficking? I mean, there's so much terminology that the actual important part, which is about exploiting somebody else for your benefit in a way that that exploited person cannot choose to get out of the situation, gets completely lost. And then we lose with that the real belief that that's not acceptable. So almost the language actually works against. Yeah, so it's really important that if we all have a good understanding of what it is we're talking about, and with that we can come together, use our voices in a coordinated way to be powerful. Like those individual voices are really powerful when they come together. And when we focus them on a specific action and opportunity, we can actually make change happen. And we've got examples of how we've done that.
Yes. No, I really love what you're saying too, because the whole idea is it's changing even to like kind of like the perception of the role the public plays. So it's not just, here's this information I want to give you. The idea of really kind of inviting the public to be allies and to actually kind of lead in it. I really love that, because it doesn't seem like, oh, there's this thing that's happening to somewhere else, but I'm an ally in this just as a public citizen. Like, this is of concern to me. Yes, I appreciate that. I really do. I'm going back to modern slavery versus historical slavery. What are the contemporary forms of what we refer to as modern slavery?
So, of course, exploiting someone for someone else's benefit is not new, and it emerges in all sorts of ways, some of which are probably more recognized than others. Examples include, of course, trafficking, and that trafficking isn't just for sexual exploitation. It can also be for labor exploitation. So someone's perhaps deceived into taking a job that's well paid, and then they get there and they find that it's not what they expected. And that covers a variety of sectors. Definitely, this is more of an issue in the sort of low paid, low skilled part of industry. So in care, construction, agriculture, manufacturing, those sorts of industries. And there's a number of ways in which, so there's the actual process of being taken from one place to another for the purpose of being exploited, which is what we would call being trafficked. But also there are examples of debt bondage, where a worker is told to pay a fee, arrangement fee, to take up a job. and is unable to repay that fee because their work's not valued at the rate it should be, and the fee grows, and then they're effectively trapped in that work situation with an unending debt held against them, which in some cases can even pass down to family, and then you have children being constantly working on this debt.
So, I mean, it really is shocking to me that that is still taking place, that debt bondage. Are there particular countries or areas of the world where debt bondage is happening, or is this happening globally?
Debt bondage is sadly fairly global. There is a strong movement to ban any recruitment fees, which helps. But in countries where there's a lot of labour, there's still a practice of paying recruitment fees, which makes it easier to effectively exploit someone. And there are certainly countries where we hear about it a lot more, particularly in South Asia. Bonded labour that's passed through family, we hear about in the brick industry, although there's been some really good efforts to tackle it. And debt bondage, especially for recruiting into labour-intensive industries. There's been some examples in Malaysia of workers from Bangladesh being held in debt bondage in different industries, manufacturing and also agricultural, including, for example, palm oil. So yes, debt bondage is still a thing, as you imply. It's also something that we know from history. Indentured labour, it was often called then, and really this is another version.
So going back to the whole notion of public citizens as allies, how does one know when they are encountering or have encountered a person who's a victim of modern slavery being trafficked? Like, what signs should someone look for?
So there's quite, it's not always easy to tell. And often by the nature of holding somebody in conditions of modern slavery, they're not free to leave where they are. So coming across them is probably not especially likely. I've given you some examples of people held in modern slavery in quite conventional settings, but there are many settings where the isolated nature of the workplace just really plays into the hands of those who are exploiting them. And that could be isolated in terms of being rural, somewhere where they, are just far removed from communities. It could be isolated in a home, for example, in domestic servitude, where the person might even be locked in the house and not actually able to leave. And then another, which is actually at sea, so working on ships, on boats, very isolated in many senses. That isolation really adds to vulnerability, and there are plenty of examples of how it's exploited by people holding others in slavery. So of course, coming across people working in those circumstances is not so likely, but for sure, it's not impossible that you might see someone who's working in conditions of modern slavery. And I think, being able to say this person isn't is really probably not something that the public is in a position to do. It really needs a professional support, because sometimes even people who are exploited themselves may not recognize the depth of their situation until they go through the process of recovering from that situation and even recognize how they've been exploited during that period.
So even if one were to suspect or come across someone, a professional intervention is more beneficial, to the situation.
Definitely. Definitely. I think the important thing, though, and this is the thing that's very challenging for that exact outcome. Now, that is what should happen, but the reality is that the professional looks like the authorities often, and there are many reasons why bringing in the authorities isn't something that people want to rush to do because of strict immigration rules. It may come back on that person that they've breached. Immigration was very likely involuntarily as a result of being exploited. Is their exploitation going to be recognised first over breaching immigration laws, for example, or even breaking loitering rules, for example, where we're campaigning right now in California to end anti-loitering laws, because it makes it very difficult for people who are victims to approach law enforcement without fear of perhaps getting a criminal record for breaking loitering rules, and then make it even more difficult to recover. So it's a very, very tricky area for sure. And I think support from organisations that are not connected to the authorities is probably the ideal scenario if it's available. And there are lots of hotlines around the world in different countries that can point to those resources. So if you see something you're not sure about, do raise it with a hotline, or pass, if you can find a way to pass a hotline number on, that's the best situation.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really good to know. Going back to the idea of the movement being survivor-led, what needs to change in the anti-slavery movement to make that happen, to make it something that is survivor-led?
So, my previous comment relates really strongly to this answer, because as you can imagine, when you're faced with other challenges, such as making sure that you're meeting immigration rules, and making sure that you're getting the support you need to recover from your situation, you way too occupied to even consider often if these are things that you face. And of course, not all victims are in this position, but this can really delay your recovery and rehabilitation, and therefore just not put you in a position to have the strength to be like a survivor advocate. So we really need to change the way that we support survivors. It's really important to get the support they need, whatever their nationality,
Right.
whatever their background, whatever they're doing, they have to be properly supported. And that's the only way that they can be empowered, and should they so choose, to stand up and be an advocate. And if they are an advocate, then of course they should be rewarded as an advocate that's leading the way in the fight. So this shouldn't be a professional movement. I'm sitting here as a director of an organization. Clearly, I am a professional in this space. I'm doing this, this is what I'm paid to do. Now, why should I be paid to do this, and somebody who's been through that experience be expected to speak at conferences, do events, and not be paid? They still have to live, they still have bills to pay. And that's another really important piece of this, is making sure that they are appropriately rewarded, but also making sure they're not tokenized, and that they do have a genuine leadership position and the space is created. And I think that's happening slowly in our movement, but the anti-slavery movement is still a little bit behind. You can't imagine, an LGBT movement with so few people who would identify as that group being part of the leadership. And it's the same. I mean, it needs to have that understanding of what we're talking about, what modern slavery is at the front lines, to really be able to make progress. And that space needs to be created for them to be able to personally be in the position to be able to take that leadership on, and then to be supported and encouraged to do that.
Yes, no, that is so important, and across so many different types of arenas where advocacy is involved. I mean, just unanimously, I think everyone always agrees that it's like the voice of the advocate, the voice of the experience. Like that's the impactful voice. And that's, I think the storytelling, of people's like lived experiences, and the empowerment piece, because more people, I think, when they see someone that has had that similar lived experience, that they've survived, that it's just, I think it gives hope, and then it also empowers other people as well. So yeah, I understand like why it's like invaluable to really have the movement be survivor led. There's one survivor in particular, a woman named Emily. I wanted to talk about her story a little bit because you share her story on your website, and Emily's not her real name. We're just going to call her for Emily for the sake of this conversation, but she's a trafficking survivor in the UK who came forward for help and found there was less than adequate support and very undignified treatment. So this is what we were just talking about. Is this the norm when someone seeks support as a trafficking survivor? And what is being done to improve those types of situations? You know, you mentioned this before, like people kind of, sometimes the authorities look like the oppressors. So it's not a welcome system. So I could see how it could be a deterrent for people to kind of want to reach out, because it's kind of, am I going to reach out for help and be punished for reaching out for help? So what are some of the ways that improvements are being made in that area to not have that barrier for survivors to reach out for support, or victims to reach out for support?
No, you're absolutely correct. That is exactly what we're fighting for better support for victims to be able to come forward and survivors to be able to recover. And I think, we can look to perhaps other movements to try and learn lessons and see how we can move forward. Perhaps I could pick as an example, in some countries, there's been a lot of progress in tackling domestic violence. Whereas once, the authorities would consider it, a private matter, not for their involvement or intervention. And now it's very widely accepted that domestic violence is unacceptable and that it is appropriate for authorities to intervene and provide protection where it's needed. And I think it's a similar situation for exploitation, that we still have a bit of progress to make in building an understanding and acceptance that some people are being exploited, and it's not because of who they are, it's not because of how they look. That doesn't actually provide any excuse for why they're treated like that, and that this is actually, it shouldn't be their this should be something that they are protected from. And I think there's a number of factors that still influence how authorities respond. And immigration is a really big one. I know I mentioned it already, but I'm going to bring it up again, because for a lot of countries now, and certainly the US and where I am here in the UK, it can become such a priority that any other matters are completely sort of blinded by this lens of this desire to tackle immigration into the country over ensuring that people's rights are protected. Of course, that doesn't apply to all cases, and it's not always relevant, but it's a really big factor, I think, in this reluctance to put in place systematic provisions to provide support to victims so that they do actually have a guaranteed opportunity to recover, whatever their immigration status. So we're making progress as legislation in countries that's being reviewed. There's still some way to go. I mean, for sure, we've been campaigning for years in the US to get better support for runaway and homeless youth. We know that runaway and homeless youth are, of course, they're more vulnerable to traffickers and to being exploited because they don't have support systems. We want to see the provision, we want to see money put aside for services that can actually identify the trafficking risks and provide support to runaway and homeless youth so that they don't fall into the hands of traffickers. We've been campaigning for that for some time. And I think it's that lack of support that's really a big problem. So whether it's, they're just a runaway kid, that's what happens, or whether it's, they're foreign, we don't really want them here, or whatever it is, the number one thing should be, their right not to be exploited. And we're not there yet. So hopefully with a good understanding of what that looks like and an acceptance that that's not tolerated, we can start shifting these policies and approaches.
Yeah, I was amazed to learn that modern slavery is the second largest international crime. Are there countries or regions where it's more prevalent? Are there countries that also it's prevalent, but they turn a blind eye, or they, drag their feet and wanting to actually kind of look at this as something that is like a top tier issue to be solved and work with organizations like Freedom United?
Yeah, it is shocking, especially because I think it's not so well understood and not so well known. And I think it takes us back again to what I said earlier in our conversation, where I was describing just some of the terms that are used under this umbrella of modern slavery. And there are more, believe me. Child slavery is one that we haven't really even touched on at the moment. And then there are sort of some vestiges of historical slavery and chattel slavery in some parts of the world that still happen. I mean, one country that comes to mind is Mauritania in West Africa there. Now, one thing that's absolutely true is that modern slavery does happen everywhere. I mean, that's how it's the second largest international crime. For sure, it's more prevalent in some countries or regions than others. The best place to look to get information on that is the Global Slavery Index. The Global Slavery Index actually lists countries by, it's an estimate, it's a global estimate that's produced by the International Labour Organization and Walk Free. And together they estimate the numbers both by raw prevalence and also government response, which is a really obviously important part of this. And as a preview, for sure, South Asia comes up as a region with a high prevalence of modern slavery. In terms of turning a blind eye, yes, there definitely are some that turn a blind eye, but you know what? That doesn't have to be like that. And I'd love to share a specific example of a country where I've been campaigning since 2009 for change to end a system that was actually imposed by the government itself, a system of slavery in the cotton industry, which of course will be familiar to many people listening to us today. And this was in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan. And after campaigning for probably about 15 years, I am really excited and happy that we have now, as a movement, declared that the end of state imposed forced labour in Uzbekistan's cotton industry. Still some forced labour happening, but that system that was run and operated and imposed by the state is no longer there.
Wow.
It obviously was a big revenue earner for the government. It felt like an incredibly ambitious ask when we started. We weren't sure that we were going to achieve it. It was, of course, embedded in the whole structure of the way that the authorities worked. But we've made it. So, change can happen, and it can happen in places where you feel like you're not going to have much influence. You haven't got much leverage, but it can.
Yes. No, that's amazing. What an incredible campaign to know that system is destabilized in that entire country now is just phenomenal. It's phenomenal. There's another campaign I know that was related to Nike I wanted to ask you about. I know that you were able to get a quarter of Nike Inc.'s investors voting for Nike to begin publishing a human rights impacts assessment of its entire supply chain, particularly to evaluate its suppliers for links to Uyghur forced labor in China, to end the state-opposed forced labor in Uzbekistan cotton. I wanted to just give a little more context to that. We were just talking about that because I didn't know Nike was related to that until I had read about that. So that Nike's investors, is that because this had to do with the cotton that was being used to make Nike's products?
Yeah, so this relates to the exploitation of Uyghur and other people living in the Uyghur region of Western China that has got some great coverage recently. And also President Biden signed the Forced Labour Prevention Act towards the end of last year, which is brilliant. It's an absolutely phenomenal move in holding corporates accountable for not using those products. China is a big exporter of cotton. Like Uzbekistan, it's a big exporter of cotton. And a lot of that cotton is grown and processed, milled, spun into yarn and woven in the Uyghur region. And a lot of Western brands buy their products in China. And some of those workers are shipped on what's called transfer schemes from the Uyghur region involuntarily to factories around the country, where they are forced to, they live on camps effectively, and they're forced to work, they're unable to leave. And the stories are pretty shocking. I think they've been well covered in the media. We are asking, as part of a coalition, we are asking companies to divest, to make sure that they have no links in their supply chains to this form of exploitation. Nike hasn't committed. They have not signed our call to action, and that's our concern. So we're saying, how can you know that you have not got cotton in some shape or form in your products or other goods that is there through the use of forced labor of these people?
Yes.
And the first step to doing that is to be transparent about exactly what's happening in your supply chain.
Right.
Research
that's
the
assessment. So they were willing to publish that assessment.
No, they were not willing to
Oh, they're
publish that.
not. Oh, I thought they were. Oh, okay. I thought that
Right.
a quarter of the investors voted for them to.
They did, but Nike themselves recommended that their investors vote against this.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
you know, in this day and age, you'd think it'd be quite a simple ask to publish a report on what's happening in your supply chain, but and Nike is certainly not alone in being cagey about what's happening in their supply chain. We're also targeting Apple too at the moment. We engaged with 5 of their biggest investors and wrote to them and asked them to vote in favor of this. So vote against Nike's directors and vote in favor of this resolution at the annual general meeting to produce this.
So I understand. So even though you had this large amount of investors who were willing and who did vote against it, it was vetoed, so to speak, by the corporation at large. They did not want to publish that information. I do feel, and Joanna, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is making global news. As recently, I feel like I've been familiar with this conversation in terms of the Olympics, in terms of a lot of athletes and others were protesting like a presence in China with the Olympics. And I remember the mention of the Uyghur people because I believe of these very types of exploitation issues.
Correct. Yep, absolutely. You know, and of course, when a vote is against the directors, it does take a larger portion than 25%. We're still happy. We're still happy with the outcome because it's brought light to this conversation, and there'll be difficult questions asked in future, but it's obviously, of course, it's not enough. We need to see that change happen. And yes, you're right. There are some big questions around the Olympics, and that we have got coverage in the New York Times about the lack of a response from the International Olympic Committee about this risk of forced labor in the Olympic supply chain. That is correct.
Yes. So and all of these campaigns, all of these programs, is there a program or an area of focus that you guys would like to add to your mission or expand upon at this time? You know, what direction do you feel like you want to take the organization to now?
Yeah, I mean, there are areas that we're absolutely focusing on going forward. We're a very small team. We're a big community. We're really keen to encourage our community to get really active and get involved and find ways they can actually be furthering the mission of building that resilience to modern slavery themselves. And we're encouraging supporters to engage with us. We're holding a campaign training session so that, you know, we can build capacity and be working alongside volunteers and community members so that this can be a bigger, wider movement. And then topics, we're still absolutely focusing on many of the topics that I've mentioned on. Definitely the Uyghur campaign is really important, and making sure that we've got safer streets in California. Amending the 13th is a big project, but to truly make sure that slavery is actually abolished in the US, is no longer allowed as a punishment for a crime, as the 13th Amendment currently states. Laws that are really holding businesses to account, making sure survivors are not detained in immigration detention. And for us as well, what's very important is that we are very mindful and respectful about how we talk about this topic, and how we make sure that we're creating, that we're supporting survivors to be leaders in this space. And we have a campaign called My Story, My Dignity, where we talk about the importance of making sure that we're not sensationalizing the experiences of people who've been in modern slavery, and that they're participating in the representation of their stories.
Yes, no, I understand that's so important, and I think it also too helps with all of the people whose attention we want to attract to this issue. That it really, I love the way that you talk about it. Like, this is a human rights issue. Like, this isn't anything that needs to be sensationalized, but like, this is really just to make it seem like it's just that logical. It's just that common sense. This is something that just should not be happening. And that there isn't really anything sensational about it. It's just it's just wrong.
You're absolutely correct, but we still see a lot of images of ropes and chains that are commonly associated with the horrors of historical slavery that don't feature in modern slavery, or very, very, very rarely. It's just not what modern slavery looks like today, where psychological coercion is used, or physical coercion, or actually restricting people's freedom of movement through like locked doors and such, and and sexualizing it as well. I mean, it's just not appropriate 100%. So that's an important part of our mission too, is to make sure that the way it's represented is actually how it looks. And it's not just because there are a lot of misinformation, unfortunately, on this topic out there, which then builds misunderstanding amongst the public that girls are swept off the street on their way to school, which actually is incredibly rare and not how it happens. So we have to really have a good and accurate understanding of what it is that's happening if we're going to tackle it. I mean, we should do it in a way that really involves survivor leaders who can give us that true understanding.
Yes, exactly. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask you about your global partners. I know that Freedom United has 113 global partners. So how do you form out, like, what do you look for in a partner, and how do you work with partners? How do you find your global partners?
I suggested before, and I was talking about another topic, but if we're going to impact change, we have to come together. We have to be working on this together and be coordinated. So when we're looking at how to tackle an issue, we don't do it on our own. I mean, there are lots of organizations out there, and we have different expertise, and we have different values that we can bring to the conversation, to the table. Freedom United really is about our community. We are, as you said, a really large global community. We can mobilize that community at the right moment to create power and to create change. But we only know how to mobilize it and exactly what to do because of the work of other organizations who are perhaps doing the research that goes into understanding the issues well, having the policy discussions with the policymakers and can see an opportune moment, or that are working with the specific community for a long time. So we'll work with organizations who have that deep and depth of understanding so that we can make sure that the role that our community is playing is right, is appropriate, and is as powerful and effective as it can be. So the partnerships do look different, and sometimes we build coalitions around particular topics so that we can be as powerful as possible, because the more of us that are all working in the same, for the same thing, the more powerful we're going to be. Yes. So we will look for shared objectives. That's like our number one thing. So do we all want to see the same end result? And we can come from different spaces. So we work with lots of organizations in the environmental field, for example, because often, where humans are exploited, the environment's exploited too. So, we've actually got same, end goal. We might have different expertise though, and different sort of areas of focus, but, we're heading in the same direction. Yes. and understanding each other's work and what we do. And it does mean that we've got this brilliant network, and
Yeah.
when you're coming in as part of the Freedom United community, it gives you like a stake in the wider anti-slavery movement and playing a role in all those many efforts that are happening around the world.
Yes, yes. No, that's I can only imagine, to be able to solve this global crisis, you need to have strategic collaborators. Like, you need to have a network of other organizations that can help you get, achieve your objectives, and also it's the shared objectives and the shared outcomes as well. So that's key. How can people get involved with Freedom United?
So the best thing to do is to, an easy thing to do is to go on freedomunited.org and sign one of our petitions. But also subscribe to our news digest. We send it out to over 600,000 people every Sunday. It's really popular, and it's a really nice digest of not the sensational news stories, but the real news stories of what's happening in modern slavery around the world. It just gives you the opportunity to sort of stay in touch, stay on top of developments and how they're happening. You can subscribe on freedomunited.org, and also if you take action on a campaign and you opt to, you can also receive the news digest like that. It's really helpful for us when you subscribe, because if we see an opportunity where we really need to gather people together to add their names onto petitions or campaigns, then we can write you and ask for your